How do you know if you have a competitive advantage in business? I was at a conference once, the entire room was packed with executives, and I asked this question. I said, how many of you believe you have a competitive advantage? And as you can imagine, about 85% of the hands in the room just shot up straight in the air. They had a competitive advantage. But then I said, look, that's impossible, because if you go by the definition of a competitive advantage, it means that you're earning above industry average profits. So that's how you know if you have a competitive advantage. So here's the challenge I have for you. Pull an income statement. Okay, you can look over the last 12 months. That's probably the best way to pull it. And then if you just go down to the very bottom line, to net income, and you look at net income as a percentage of revenue, and you compare that to the rest of your industry, or even better yet, to your competitive set, then you'll know whether or not you're earning above industry average profits or above your competitive set's average profits. And if you are, then you have some type of competitive advantage. If not, you're tricking yourself. Now look, I've been there before. I used to believe that I had this competitive advantage which involved my people. I'd say, oh, my people are my competitive advantage. But we don't own people. And if you don't believe me that people aren't a competitive advantage, think about the old Verizon commercials. Remember the guy who's like, can you hear me now? Good. Can you hear me now? Good. Well, he left and he went and worked for another company. All right, so they lost their competitive advantage. And that's why people aren't a competitive advantage, because they're transient and you can't own them. Also, if you think about Jared with Subway, for years they had Jared as a spokesman selling Subway sandwiches. Well, that ended terribly because he got into a lot of trouble out there by doing a lot of bad things personally. All right, so people who I thought were my competitive advantage actually weren't my competitive advantage. So there are competitive advantages that are real. Number one, we could have positional advantages, which is maybe we're located in a certain geography, which allows us to compete better than our peers. Maybe we can price our services better because we have this geographical advantage, or maybe our cost structure is lower. For example, maybe we're located closer to a quarry where we buy materials from, and therefore our costs are lower compared to our rivals because they have to drive all the way across town to get the same supplies. Or perhaps, in addition to the positional advantage, maybe we have an asset advantage. Now, the asset advantage can be tangible or intangible. Think about software code. Maybe you have software code that gives you an advantage, right? Because you can use the software to build this platform, or you have an algorithm or whatever it may be that makes your product or service super valuable. Or maybe you have an asset advantage. Maybe you have a fleet of equipment that's really expensive. Think about a mining operation. You know, some of those vehicles are super expensive, millions of dollars. So trying to get into the space may be really difficult for rivals because you have that asset advantage. So first, you have positional advantages, you have asset advantages, and then the third type of advantage is capability-based advantages. So maybe your organization has some type of capability. They're really fast, they can execute at lightning speed, or maybe they have a collaboration advantage, or some other type of advantage, a strategic advantage, or a customer experience capability advantage, whatever it may be, but the team has certain capabilities which allows them to deliver products and services at a better value or at a lower cost, or they're just able to deliver an experience that is unique and personalized to the end user, which makes your product very advantageous. All right, so those are the three main competitive advantages: positional, asset, and capability based. Now, like I said, when I'm working with organizations, oftentimes when I go in there, they're like, yep, Steve, we have a ton of competitive advantages. Then I look at their bottom line, I'm like, no, you don't. Look at your profitability. Your profitability is below industry average. And you could also do this calculation as well. You can find your return on invested capital. Now, if you are in a business where you have a lot of lumpy investments, it may not work, it may not be as pertinent, or maybe you're in a capital light business like professional services or technology and you don't have a lot of assets, maybe this formula won't work for you. But for the majority of companies, return on invested capital does work. Now, you can compute this by taking your net operating profit after tax and dividing it by your capital base. So what's in invested capital? You have two things. Number one, you have your working capital, less excess cash and interest-bearing debt, and you have your net property, plant, and equipment. So if you head over to your balance sheet and you take your current assets, less excess cash, if you're sitting on a bunch of cash above and beyond what you need to normally operate your business, you want to exclude that, and then take your current liabilities and exclude interest-bearing debt because you don't want any short-term debt or revolving debt that you're incurring interest on to be in that calculation. So just take current assets minus those things, less current liabilities minus those things, and you'll end up with your working capital base. Then take your net property, plant, and equipment, which is your gross property, plant, and equipment, or your investment in buildings, vehicles, equipment, etc. to run the business, less accumulated depreciation. So those two things, working capital and net PP&E, equals your invested capital base. So if you take your NOPAT, net operating profit after tax, and you divide that by your invested capital, you end up with return on invested capital. This will also help you to understand whether or not you have a competitive advantage. Because then if you compare that to your cost of capital, your wiggity whack, your weighted average cost of capital, I say wiggity whack, it's not really wiggity whack technically, it's just whack, your weighted average cost of capital. But if you compare your return on invested capital to your weighted average cost of capital, let's say your weighted average cost of capital, in other words, your blend of debt and equity is 10%, and your return on invested capital is 9%, that means you have a cost of your capital of 10, but you're only earning 9. That means as you go on, you're losing effectively 1% value in your business. So you want to ensure your return on invested capital is higher than your weighted average cost of capital. And if it's extremely high, then this may also be an indicator that you have some type of competitive advantage. All right, I don't mean to burst your bubble. I don't mean to hurt your feelings. I just wanted to put this episode out there because I don't want you walking around believing you have competitive advantages that you may not have. Now, developing competitive advantages are really important. And I'll just say this. Build advantages that customers care about. This is a huge mistake that I see businesses make over and over again. They pursue these competitive advantages, right? So in their strategic sessions, they define these things that are going to give them a leg up on their competition. But guess what? Their customers may not care about these things. Let's say you are in the craft business, all right? So you believe in craft artisan when you're making your product or service. So you source local products which cost a lot more than sourcing it elsewhere, and you just believe in this whole purpose. That's great, okay? I'm not poo-pooing that at all. But if your customers don't care about it, you're making these products or you're delivering these services, but if they're not willing to pay the price, then nobody's gonna buy your product or service. So you have to invest in competitive advantages that your customers care about. So how do you do that? You do that by getting very clear on your ideal customer profile. You have to uncover what are their dream outcomes, what are their obstacles and pain points that they're facing. And you have to help them to realize like the promised land that they're trying to get to. And you try to eliminate as much friction as possible and deliver a great experience along the way. And when you could do that, and you could deliver your products and services uniquely, then you're going to drive a ton of value for your customers. They're going to appreciate that, and that's going to be a competitive advantage. So please don't invest in things that customers don't care about, especially competitive advantages, because you're only going to be tricking yourself. All right, if you need help with any of these calculations, I know I get nerdy sometimes and I talk about return on invested capital and PP&E and all these other things. If you need help with any of this stuff, you could go to your accountant and ask them to help you, but maybe your accountant doesn't give you the strategic guidance that you need. If that's the case, I'm always here to help. You could go to coltivar.com if you want to connect with me. But nonetheless, I just want to educate you about these topics because as you put them in place in your business, light bulbs are going to go off and you're going to be able to focus on the areas that are truly driving value. Thanks for joining me for this episode. Be sure to share and subscribe. Until next time, cheers.